listening to a Tax Justice Network podcast covering the 10 worst global offenders identified by the Financial Secrecy Index in 2018. Even though it's such an important global offender, the United Kingdom, if we don't include its satellite havens, doesn't feature in the top 10 in the 2018 index. And this time it's even dropped down to number 23. It also has a low secrecy score of 42.35 out of 100. But it has a global market share of over 17%. It needs a podcast all of its own to explain why that is. I'm Naomi Fowler and I'm talking to John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. The United Kingdom, the Tax Justice Network always makes the point that if we were to combine it with all its satellite havens, its overseas territories and crown dependencies, where much of all the dirty stuff gets done before it arrives in the City of London, the UK would in fact be number one on the Financial Secrecy Index, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, global offender. This kind of interconnected, criminogenic environment that it has created. Last time in the Financial Secrecy Index, it was number 15, if taken alone, not with its satellite havens. This time it's gone down quite a few places to number 23. We shouldn't get too excited about this for some of the reasons I've just mentioned, but the UK actually has a very low secrecy score this time round in particular. Let's talk about that first. Why such a low secrecy score?
Yeah, at face value, the UK's secrecy score, which is 41 out of 100, places it amongst the least secretive and the most cooperative jurisdictions in the world. And I think we need to give credit where it's due. Successive British governments have been committing themselves to bringing forward legislative measures, in other words, laws, regulations, to strengthen transparency. For example, they've signed up to automatic information exchange through the Global Common Reporting Standard, signed up to country-by-country reporting by multinational companies. They've actually put a public registry of ownership of companies into place, and they've even created a register of trusts. But I would say that that register of trust so far is not made public. There's a deficiency there. And, last year we saw the Criminal Finances Bill coming through, which brings forward measures like unexplained wealth orders, which target people who buy in huge assets, London properties and this, that, and can't explain the source of the wealth they use to buy those assets. So all of that's, at one level, very good stuff. Many of these measures have taken effect in the last couple of years, which explains why you've seen this huge drop from number 15 on the index to number 25. And that's remarkable. And ordinarily, I'd say such a huge improvement should be cause for celebration, break open the champagne and all that. And yet, somehow the success isn't what it seems to be. In fact, I think we would see it as a hollow and something of a sham success. And there are several reasons for this, because alongside those laws, which might arguably just be window dressing, we've seen the constant degradation of the ability of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, for example. The power to tax has been waning because we've been losing the necessary skills and the workforce needed to tax effectively. We've also seen, of course, that the UK historically, and particularly the City of London, it doesn't do its dirty work in London. It uses its satellite tax havens in the Channel Islands, for example, in the Cayman, in Gibraltar, British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, Anguilla. And of course, these places are very familiar to our listeners because we've all read about the Panama Papers, which largely involved British Virgin Island companies. We've heard about Paradise Papers. The law firm itself was British. Appleby's is a British law firm operating out of Bermuda and Jersey and places like that. And of course, Britain also has a large number of Commonwealth countries, which feature very heavily in the index. So, we're talking about places like Singapore and Hong Kong and Mauritius, all of which have been mentioned in other contexts. So we're looking at an offshore spider web which spreads right the way across the world. And that spider's web is the darker side beyond the legal window dressing that British governments have been putting into place in the last few years.
And the British government's also been talking about a beneficial ownership register of the real owners of UK property bought by foreign companies. That they've been talking about since 2017. It's been delayed very recently in Parliament and will only now come into effect in 2021. So if you've got property that you don't want anyone to know about in Britain, you know you've got several years left to reorganise your affairs.
Yeah, I think this is another feature which is worth discussing in the context of tax haven Britain, because we see these delays and degradation of laws. Bit of history here for listeners outside the UK. Criminals, crooks and so on have been laundering money into Britain for decades, and of course one of their favourite ways of holding that money is by buying up British real estate. And the investigating journalists at Private Eye have created a map which you can download or look at online, showing how much of Britain actually belongs to foreign companies registered in tax havens like the British Virgin Islands. So I think that when you talk about this delay, we've got to look at this delay as something of a tactic which is deliberately put into place to allow these owners of properties enough time to be able to reorganise their asset holdings, create more sophisticated offshore structures in order to avoid ending up being disclosed on the UK public registry. And it's a deliberate attempt to reassure people using tax haven Britain that it's business as usual despite the law.
Right. And the UK continues to represent a particular threat, says the Financial Secrecy Index, to global economic security. If we look back at the financial crisis, 2007-2008, that led to the bailout of all those banks, all the trails seem to lead back to London. Nearly all of the big headlining Wall Street bank collapses had their London operations. They were doing things in London that they would never have been able to get away with in the United States, funnily enough.
Yes, that's precisely why Britain is a major threat to stability, financial stability and social stability around the world. London is so important partly because of the size of its offshore financial market share. In terms of the global market share, it's absolutely enormous. In fact, like the United States, it belongs into what we might call the global super major league of tax havens. And the threat lies partly there. But more importantly, there's a kind of a political issue at play here, because the British government itself has become captive to the special interests of the City of London. It's known as state capture. And the City of London's interests lie in always pushing for light touch regulation. That's the term they use. The term we might use would be lax regulation. The public might call it crap regulation. In other words, regulation which is so lax that it allows this criminal and corrupt activity happening all the time. And at the same time, the City of London, and of course that means the banks that operate there and their big accounting firms, constantly pushing for tax reductions, particularly for their clients. So this level of over-dependence on the British economy and this state capture is so extreme in the case of the United Kingdom that no government has been prepared to take effective measures to prevent the banks from endlessly engaging in criminal activities. It's as bad as that. In other words, you've got a long list of market rigging, mis-selling insurance products, supporting money laundering, promoting and enabling tax evasion, and so on and so on. All of this happens in Britain precisely because UK governments don't have the courage to take action against the City of London. And that makes the United Kingdom a textbook example of what is known by economists as the finance curse, which doesn't just afflict the UK economy, but it does affect the UK economy. It also inflicts poor standards and financial instability and criminality on the rest of the world. In other words, London has become a very major part of that criminogenic ecosystem within which corrupt financial practices happen globally.
And another area of concern is how the UK treats the taxing of multinational companies like the United States. It's been competing with the likes of Ireland or the Netherlands as well, and it's going to be offering 18% statutory rate, not the actual rate that companies are going to pay even. That's by 2019. And the NGO Eurodad estimated recently that on the current race to the bottom that's going on between nations on corporate taxation, the average global corporate tax rate is going to be zero by 2052. I mean, the Tax Justice Network actually thinks it's going to happen a lot sooner than that. So we're seeing this push towards the death of corporate taxation, with very much the UK at the front of it all.
Yeah, it's very worrying, and I think it's going to happen faster than some people suspect. Look, back in the 1980s, when I first started looking at this phenomenon in the early 1980s, that is the phenomenon of this race to the bottom on tax rates and on standards, regulatory standards generally. At that time, I assumed, wrongly as it turns out, that the race would stop at zero. In other words, when countries reached the level of corporate income tax rate of zero, that's where the race would stop, and that would be the end of it. Well, I was wrong. And I was wrong because in practice the race doesn't stop at zero, it just keeps going right on into negative territory. In other words, that means that governments will end up subsidising corporations to invest within their borders. And they will compete against one another to offer ever higher subsidies to attract that investment. This is a complete perversion of anything that one will know as capitalism. In fact, it's not capitalism, it's state socialism targeting the corporate community. It's called the corporate welfare state.
Right. Another concern is Britain's controlled foreign companies laws, which ActionAid has estimated would cost developing countries £4 billion. That's about $6 billion a year in lost tax revenues.
Yeah, again, this is part of this race to the bottom thing. Because in 2010, the government imposed austerity on the UK economy. But at the same time, this government created a small working party to advise on how to create what they called a competitiveness agenda for corporate taxation, a competitive tax state. Now, this working party consisted entirely of representatives of big UK businesses and their tax advisors. No one else. And not surprisingly, what big businesses always wants is more tax cuts and subsidies. And that's exactly what they got. They wanted a relaxation or a slackening of the previously existing rules on the so-called controlled foreign corporations. That is, subsidiaries set up by these companies in tax havens, which are used to shift their profits to tax havens. They wanted those rules relaxed. And obligingly, the coalition government did precisely that. What they did at the time was effectively to put up a gigantic banner in the UK telling big businesses that tax haven Britain welcomes corporate tax avoidance. You can use the relaxed controlled foreign corporation rules precisely to shift your profits offshore.
We should give special mention as well to the billions that are being laundered every year through Britain's limited liability partnerships, and especially the wild west of the Scottish limited partnerships. Even though the law was changed recently demanding that Scottish limited partnerships must reveal their owners, the vast majority, and that's more than 28,000 that we know of, have just failed to do that, either by exploiting some kinds of loopholes around that or just ignoring the legislation completely. So important to mention that enforcement isn't part of the measures in the Financial Secrecy Index. Very difficult to measure for that.
Yeah, look, laws on the statute book mean nothing unless they're enforced. So when you talk about enforcement, you point exactly to the problem, because weak law enforcement is just another part of the tax haven Britain ecosystem. The rule of law, to all intents and purposes, at that level has disappeared. And if the penalties don't serve as a deterrent. So that's the starting point, and I think that's where we are at the moment. If you look, for example, at Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the tax authority, it's woefully understaffed, it lacks resources. The Serious Fraud Office in the UK also lacks capacity to investigate and is not adequately supported at a political level. Government ministers interfere to plead on behalf of criminal banks. I mean, think, for example, of HSBC, where you had the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's the Finance Minister, going across to Washington to try to protect HSBC from criminal investigations which would have led to their losing their license to trade in the United States. So here you have ministers of the Crown interfering to protect criminal organisations. What that illustrates for me is a really disturbing level of state capture by the city of the UK government.
The United Kingdom has often liked to distance itself from its satellite havens, Crown dependencies and overseas territories, and has always said, well, it's nothing to do with us, it's up to them. And, ever so politely requested if they wouldn't possibly mind introducing public registers of the real owners of companies, deliberately intervened to exempt trusts from European efforts on transparency there. So there is a real high level of complicity because, in fact, the UK could do a lot to bring its overseas territories and crown dependencies into line with international transparency standards, and it's choosing not to.
That's precisely the point. If the United Kingdom government wanted to do it, it could do it tomorrow. It doesn't need to send gunboats. It has the power under international law to require its crown dependencies and overseas territories to take actions immediately. And it's shown in the past that it will use those powers when it suits it. I mean, it has imposed laws, and it has the power to impose laws from Westminster on all of these territories. So the fact that it chooses not to do so speaks volumes in itself. Under international law, and this has been confirmed in the British constitutional reviews going back to the Kilbrandon Commission in the 1970s, UK has the right to impose laws directly. It can intervene. It already has to ratify every single law coming out of every single dependent territory. And we have to ask ourselves, why does it not intervene? The reason is obvious, because Britain has now become so dependent upon its tax haven model that it cannot do without it any longer. It's like a junkie. It's hooked. Far too many of the British elites, including political elites, use tax havens. There's a gigantic British establishment which is deeply embedded in the whole tax haven industry and protects the tax haven industry. And you talk to officials at the OECD in Paris and you'll find that it's been British governments that have been blocking attempts to include trusts in international information exchange mechanisms. It will take one hell of a push from grassroots to unhook Britain from this addiction to tax havenry.